Oh, did I in the class? Yeah. Right. All right. And there's transcription going. Yeah, we can turn that off. Yeah, well, it's also interesting to have the transcription. I think it's interesting. And let's see, this is actually, I can turn this, I can adjust this. Perfect, so I can, fantastic. Thank you so much. Good morning. Wait, maybe I'll do this. No, we need that. Sorry, I have to hide behind the screen because otherwise the video doesn't work. But right, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first class of applied linguistics. So the plan for today is to give you a general introduction, the course content, and then together. Oh, right. Yes. I think if you're in class, you're better off turning that off, otherwise there's an echo. And I just wanted to check. There was a couple of students emailed me, they wanted to. Oh, this is distracting, it's doing captions in Italian. Right. So let's see, if I can change now, lingua, inglese. Which well, I'm going to put English. I have a mixture of a British and American English, but I'll do American. We'll see what it does. All right. Okay, so my name's Julia Bincini. And here's the plan for this course. Well, here's some important information. My email. We'll have office hours. I had actually just updated this when there was an error. They changed the timetable. Then I saw it was at 9 and I freaked out and came over here and then I changed my office hours. Office hours will be after class on Tuesdays or by appointment when we're around. And you will eventually find everything you need in Virtuale once they open the space for me, right? So everything you need, all the course slides, the PDFs. There's a PDF, I'll tell you where you can actually download the PDF of the book. I won't email it to you because there's copyright issues, but because it's available online, you can actually download it yourselves. Right? So everything you need will be there. And updates to bibliography, extra readings, links, notices, etc. But I'm still waiting for my Virtuale space to be created. And I'm new here, meaning I just started this job on October 1st. So as you know, transition, sometimes the technology is different and so on. And Irina is connected from home. Are you at home, Irina? No.
Yes, I am.
Did you send the email to everyone? Because I wanted the group chat. Because I don't remember her name. It was one student who said she couldn't come in today, and could she? I just wanted to make sure that. Yeah. Oh, okay, all right. Well, as long as you're in touch with them and let them know what's going on. So there are quite a few readings. So the book is very helpful because it tells you everything about this area of applied linguistics. And I'll tell you more about this approach in a minute, right? And so it's a safe space to go back to and find things. There's more information in the book than you really need to know, but it's also good to have that kind of resource. And then we'll also be reading some more challenging readings on what it means to understand and produce language in general, and also articles, sort of research articles on how language works in our heads. When we comprehend, when we produce our first language, a second language, when we do dialogue, when we process multimodal input. So I've selected a series of articles that I think are interesting and important. And here I say, I think, because this is just my sort of perspective where I'm coming from. But we will also, with your input, with such a small group, decide what articles we wish to maybe add, substitute, delete, and so on. I've chosen these articles because they build up on each other. They build up on some basic concepts, and then there's sort of any reading selection, especially in a vast area, is right. Psycholinguistics is a vast field, and so the readings are a selection, and it's my selection. They reflect where I come from, what I know, okay? And so that's how I chose them. So they're chosen to build up on each other and then allow you to gain knowledge gradually. But we'll start from the book, because the book lays out some foundation, some core concepts, and then we'll read the original articles. So you'll also notice that maybe you've read something and presented in one way, and then you find it again presented differently. And this is sort of a very important skill in general, to be able to reformulate, to understand things and reformulate them in a different, explain them in different terms, right? So it's important for your careers, your professional careers, as well as it's a basic skill in general whenever you study academically or present and maybe end up going into different professions, but including research, sort of understanding something and then reformulating it, in other words. Fantastic. Right, so I said that there's a book, and this book is written by a linguist, Paul Warren, and this book is actually, it's called Introduction to Psycholinguistics. So I don't know if anybody has any background in psycholinguistics. Have you ever taken a psycholinguistics course? Do you know what psycholinguistics is? Or do you have an idea of what psycholinguistics is? What do you think? What do you think it is? Psycholinguistics. Any guesses? Yes. Our shapes, our behavior. Interesting, right? So you said how it works in our mind. Yeah, absolutely. That's essential. That's what it can how it affects both perceiving systems. Right, and now that's actually an extra step, right? So how language works in our mind. Yes, that's actually what psycholinguistics does. How we comprehend what we're doing right now requires lots and lots of skills, right? And that's what psycholinguistics study, right? But then you added something interesting, and that's a very interesting question of, well, what happens to our mind when you encode things in language? Does it change the way you think, right? And that's a very profound question, and I don't have the answer to that question. But it is an interesting question. But that would be an area of psycholinguistics. Certainly, I'm happy that you don't know anything about psycholinguistics. And the reason is that this means that you actually have an unbiased, you're coming, with that curiosity, and you're not shaped and molded by like all of the theories and so on. So keep that curiosity alive, right? So psycholinguistics is essentially about how it is that humans, not machines, humans comprehend and
I'm sorry,
produce
Professor. I'm sorry to
language
interrupt you.
in a nutshell. And it's certainly cognitive, right? So you can study language use from a variety of perspectives. You can study language and society, sociolinguistics, and so on. This is a cognitive, it's a definitely about what's happening or what happens in our heads. Yes. Yes, Veronica, can you hear me?
Yes, hello, good morning. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
Hello,
I cannot hear you really well when you move. So please, if you
Oh,
could
you
speak to
can't-
the mic.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you
Thank you.
so,
I have a
so much.
tendency, I like to walk around and go up to people, but I should be. Veronica, can you tell me if I sit and don't move, is it better?
Yeah, way better. Thank you.
Oh, okay. This is actually.
I'm
Right.
so sorry. Next
I'm
time I
glad
will
you
be in
can't see
class.
me, Veronica, because I'm doing, all right, all right, the microphone is in the webcam. Is this better?
Way better, yeah.
All right, thank you. think I want to save the transcript and see how it does compared to the actual audio. Can you see? Can you check? I mean, what does it look like? I can't see it when while I'm talking. How accurate is it? Is it doing a good job? Good. That's amazing, isn't it? The technology. Right. Okay, so introducing psycholinguistics does not require sophisticated knowledge in either formal or experimental linguistics or psycholinguistics. But if you have this background, bring it to class, right? If you've taken, how many people have taken linguistics? I'm sure you've taken general linguistics. All of you have taken general linguistics. And so psycholinguistics really is an interdisciplinary field. It really is the blending of linguistics with some of the experimental methods that come from cognitive science. And cognitive science means studying the human mind through the tools of experimentation, computer modeling, simulations, mathematics, right? So it really is a highly interdisciplinary field. And I believe that that this is very relevant to interpreters. Because when you interpret, you're doing, I'll use some technical terms now, but you're doing real-time language use, and you're doing it in a very complex situation because you're processing input in one language and producing it in another language. And I've chosen this book because it actually devotes quite a lot of time, 7 chapters, on the processes of language production. Now I'm going to ask you a question. What do you think, if I were to ask you for a definition of language production, what is language production? What would you say? Process determine yes, the cognitive processes that go on that allow us to talk. Where does language production happen? So what do yes. Oh, I thought you had the answer. Okay, yes, language production happens in the brain. Language production actually happens even when you don't talk. It does. So language production, and we'll see this in the course, happens. You can have language production without saying anything at all, right? So language production is to some extent invisible. You see the output of it when there's overt articulation, when you actually articulate something. But in fact, a lot of we'll see this, so trust me, we'll see this, that a lot of what happens in language production is invisible, and hence you have to study it experimentally. Language production happens to be the area of applied linguistics that my research is in, so I know quite a bit about language production in different populations. So I've studied children, adults, people with disorders, right? And so that's actually what I trained in. I mean, my specialty is language production. So I know a lot about and sometimes when you know a lot about an area, you end up paradoxically thinking that you don't know enough, right? It's just like it's a Pandora's box, language production. So language production is important to interpreters because what we do when we speak in our first language and we speak conversationally, we have this illusion that it's actually really simple. You just talk. You go and have lunch and you chat and you talk about what you did in class today. I mean, conversation. Because we're very skilled at it. But if you look at it through the lens of cognition, and that was another point, it's actually a very complex skill. And you can see where I'm getting to now. Like, how is it that such a complex task, when you analyze it cognitively, how is it that humans can do so well at language production? And then it helps you understand sort of you're trading off the balancing, the paradoxical fact that we're very skilled at talking under normal circumstances, like not if you've had a stroke or, right, then it becomes really effortful and challenging, even in your first language. And we're aware of the difficulty of the skill when we learn another language. It's an incredibly complex, probably the most complex cognitive task we actually do. So we're very skilled at it. And sometimes this leads us to sort of underestimate how difficult it is, right? So we'll take what we know about monolingual production, those models, and then apply it to interpreting. What is it? What happens when you're a multilingual? And then when you do something as complex as interpreting. So it'll give you an insight into what happens in your own, well, in people's minds when they speak, and how hard it actually is, and what factors make it easier and harder, right? So it's a combination of linguistics, because linguistics, the units in linguistics tell you something about the representations, phonemes, morphemes, verbs, verb argument structure, etc., dependencies. But psycholinguistics makes it dynamic. It tells you how those representations are accessed and processed in real-time language use. So that's what the book is about. And you can actually, well, we'll look at the resources. So the book is written in a very accessible language. It explains, it has all kinds of additional resources that come along with the textbook. And so it has flashcards for, sort of definitions and so on, demos for some of the experimental techniques that people use, and then links to additional content. And because the book was written by a linguist, not a psychologist, it sort of has this more linguistic kind of bent. And the book is organized into, well, it's 13 chapters. And the 13 chapters cover, 7 chapters cover language production. And then the rest of the chapters cover language comprehension. And you could actually you could start reading comprehension from comprehension, sort of, and then from chapter 8 is comprehension. But we'll follow the book in terms of starting with production. And it actually does a very good job at presenting what some of the issues are in language production and what kind of data you can look at to understand how language production works. And it's a good place to start. Right, so what eventually will be on Virtuale, once they open it up for me, is everything you need. All of the readings, all of the PowerPoints, everything. And hopefully I'll be able to save the video capture of the classes. And I'm considering an activity that I wanted your opinion about. So I've recently become interested in, not recently, but sort of relatively recently, in how people process multimodal input, meaning when you have speech and captions. And I actually have a PhD student from my previous university who's actually finishing her PhD studying the effect of captions and different presentation speeds on comprehension and so on, and using automatic speech recognition. And I'm interested in this issue for a variety of reasons, including making content accessible, right? So if you have multimodal input, then you've got the audio, then you've got the written. And transcribing speech is a very time-consuming process. I know you're doing it for Professor Cervini's class, right? You have to transcribe. Who's taking Italian linguistics? Are you all taking Italian linguistics, right? So you have a transcription, you have to transcribe a speech, right? Oh, you haven't done it yet. Yes. And that's actually a very useful exercise to transcribe speech, because then you realize, well, lots of things. You realize some of the properties of spontaneous speech, all of the redundancies, the disfluencies, the false starts, and so on. Those are characteristic of spoken. Even in what I'm doing now, this is sort of semi-extemporaneous, so I know what I'm talking about, but it's not planned, right? And so you have all of those characteristics of spoken, which are very interesting to psycholinguists, because then you can actually analyze spoken in a variety of points of view. But one activity I wanted your opinion about was, what do you think of taking a segment from the class content and doing it with automatic speech recognition as an activity, and then checking accuracy? So because I've thought about it. I think it's an interesting, it's an interesting domain. So captions, you can use them, right, in all kinds of settings, but in an educational context, obviously it's a, stylized type of situation, and it's got some genre specific characteristics. So you have a professor talking and then some, sort of interaction and so on. And automatic speech recognition systems have really improved in these settings. I started using them because I had deaf students in my former university. And so it was a question of making content accessible. So having the transcript and the sign language interpreter, but then it was sort of access to the captions and so on. But you can then do things, you can transform. When something's digitized, you can actually transform it and turn it into a different input. So that was sort of an idea I had of saying, well, let's video record the lessons, and if everything is okay with, being audio recorded, because then obviously our voice is protected, it's sort of sensitive data and so on, but to use it as a tool to check how the system works. And then there's a whole area of psycholinguistics. It's sort of the intersection of psycholinguistics and audiovisual reception studies of how it is that people process captions in real time. So there's lots of studies, sort of the intersection of psycholinguistics with audiovisual translation, and what happens when you're actually doing audio and video at the same time. Audio meaning the written. So you've got written, you're processing written language. So you're processing captions in a setting like in an educational setting. And questions of how much information, where you display it, cognitive load, right? Because typically when you, like I'm doing now, you've got me talking, you've got the slide, and maybe complicated information on the slide when it gets complicated. And then in this case, now it's on the chat, but you would actually have it displayed like in a video with captions. And this becomes cognitively interesting because now you have codes that are, yes, one's visual and the other one's auditory, but they're both linguistic. So you're getting, words, or chunking, and you're processing in real time with audio. So that's an interesting research area that intersects sort of the psycholinguistics, technology, audiovisual translation, and interpreting. And yeah, I'm just looking now at the caption. But in this class, we're going to focus on, as I said, what we do, what humans do, how humans do it, not how machines do it, how humans do it, how humans do language. And by doing, I mean language use. All right. So let me just give you a little back. So for the exam, let me talk about the exam. So because it's a small group and you're graduate students, you're MA students, and you're highly motivated, and I don't necessarily believe in that kind of traditional exam where you just have to learn stuff and, kind of regurgitate. I don't want to use the term regurgitate it, but so I've tentatively thought of then you have to think of options, right? Attenders, non-attenders. That for attenders, I would like you to, in pairs, choose a reading, either from the readings in the assigned bibliography, the one that I came up, or something you want to present. That's where it's like your input, something I don't, something that's connected to the course content, but that you would be responsible for then either or discussing it with me. So either something from the reading list, or something that you discuss with me. And towards the end of the course, have sort of a presentation. So you would be lecturing, basically. You wouldn't be being assessed as a, like as a student, but you would be being assessed as somebody who's actually knows about the topic and is presenting it to an audience, right? So that would be in pairs, and you decide who you work with, what topic you choose, and the presentation. So you could do anything you want. And that requires, again, what's really important is for everybody else to be there as an audience. So you're doing it for other people. You're presenting not to show, well, not to show off what you know, but if you're a good communicator, right? So if it's a topic that people don't know about, do you give them enough background and so on? So that would be a component of the exam, sort of a, you do, obviously you prepare that at home and then you deliver it in the class room. All right. What do you think? This is something I do when I have small groups, kind of seminar style. What do you think of this evaluation? Sort of, yes, but it would be, so right now you don't know what topics, right? So I will start presenting things. So I'll present articles and we'll discuss the article. So that sort of gives you a template as for what I expect from you, right? So it's not out of the blue. It's not any topic. It's a topic within this area of applied linguistics. Okay, so it could be I don't know, something on interpreting and bilingualism, or I mean, any topic that's relevant to the course. So, for example, not climate change, right? That's not relevant. I mean, it's not that it's not relevant, it is relevant, but what I mean is right? And something like maybe a research paper plus an overview, maybe something that I don't cover in class. Okay, but I'll show you the list of papers that I chose for the course. They're actually, I just put them up on the syllabus page. And that's the selection of papers that I came up with. So it could be one of those or something else, right? Something you're interested in. Well, it could be something on does language change cognition, right? Sort of, it could be something like that, or something an area that we don't touch upon, okay? And that's a good practice for you, because then the more English you practice, I mean, that's also good, right? Because presentation skills and sort of synthesizing and presenting, going from, and integrating, this is also very important, being able to come up with information and integrate information from different sources, right? And then present it in a way that's accessible, keeping in mind that you have, who your audience is. Okay, so that would be sort of obviously for people who are attenders, okay, when we'll pick dates and so on. And then another part of the exam is the written exam. So the written exam is an open book written exam. Open book means you have access to everything. So class notes and the PowerPoint presentations and all of the readings. Okay, so this means that the questions these are short essays, around 400 words, 450 words, and they typically require that you know where to go and look for things. Or it could be something like, a question about a study that we read about, and maybe I'll show you the graph, like the data, and ask you to comment and explain in English what those data show, right? So it's something showing, it's tapping into your critical thinking and being able to access information and bring it together. Okay, sort of it's a complex skill, right? So it doesn't require memorization, but it's a difficult task because it means that you have to know where to find things, right? And then I'll give you examples of those kinds of questions. So this would be in class, during exam time, sort of at the end. I know our course, we meet twice a week till the end of November, and then we have, we can also, I think we have some flexibility. My former university had zero flexibility. The exam dates were that we couldn't change anything. It was, but if we have flexibility and it's easier for you to do it before the break, at the end of December, then we'll do it. Okay. Again, I'm talking about attenders. Non-attenders will find something different, but I'm absolutely flexible in terms of your schedules and so on, and doing it in a way that's easy, right? So flexible. Okay. That's an important word. And then I was thinking of doing this sort of in-class portion of it, checking maybe the transcriptions from the automatic speech recognition, right? So that would require choosing a segment from one of the videos from the course and checking the accuracy of the transcription system. So that to become aware of, then that means you have to listen and then reflect on what the nature of the errors is and whether those errors impact comprehension, right? Because you can have errors that are there, but that don't really impact comprehension, right? So we'll talk about, there's two ways to measure errors, in terms of words, but also in terms of the consequences of an error, okay? So, a hands-on activity, a written exam, and a presentation, okay? How does that sound? Right. Okay. And if you think of assessment tasks, so I'm new to teaching interpreting students. I've never taught interpreting students, right? So I'm here, and I'll learn from you. So if there are things that you think would be useful, please feel free to give your input, right? So anytime you teach a course, and I'm sort of, it's kind of a journey, you go along together, students learn, it really depends, it's a dialogue, it's students learn and the professor learns. There's no class from which I haven't learned something from my students. Sometimes in terms of teaching style, or you think that something was clear, but then it wasn't. So this gets to an important point that as a human being, I need your feedback. If something isn't clear, please, there's lots of ways to do this, to say, maybe I'll explain something, or something wasn't clear in a paper, and I'll deliberately give you difficult papers. Some of them are challenging. One way to make sure that you understand is to say, I just want to make sure I understand this. Could I rephrase it? Because so explaining something, and this is an exercise I actually learned from a statistics course many, many, many years ago. And it was about providing a summary of what the findings were in a study in a way that you could actually tell your grandma. Now, without stereotyping grandmas, maybe somebody's grandma is a Nobel Prize winner or whatever, but it was like, can you convey the same information in ways that are accessible and using simple language, right? So that's a good way to check on your comprehension, sort of to not hide behind, sort of abstract terminology. And obviously, like any discipline, any area of linguistics, psycholinguistics, including psycholinguistics, there's a lot of specific terminology, jargon, right, technical. So for example, instead of saying, and this is why I like the Warren book, because the Warren book tends to avoid jargon. So for example, one of the chapters we'll read is about how it is that we find words in our minds. Okay, so the chapter is called Finding Words. So when you want to say something and you know the concept and you have to find the word, he uses the term finding the word. But the technical term in psycholinguistics is very abstract. It's lexical access. Lexical access. Now, most of you native Italian speakers, right? So accesso lessicale, you can probably figure out what it is, right? But it's the same concept is finding words, accessing words in the mental lexicon. Okay, so that's a good exercise for you to do to make sure that you understand. Can I say it so at any time during class, when we get to know each other better, you'll feel comfortable to do that and say, I just want to make sure, or let me, rephrase this, okay? Because that's a way to practice reformulating, but also to make sure that you understand, okay? Right, so I said that psycholinguistics is really an area, an area of applied linguistics that is informed by tools, theories, and methods from broadly the set of disciplines called cognitive science. So cognitive science is looking at the complexity of the human mind through different disciplines. And these are quite different, but in this case, we're intersecting an interest in language. Okay, so how does language work? How do humans store language, acquire language, comprehend language, produce language? And cognitive science was influenced by these disciplines. Computer science, and here you can see sort of the computer science, psychology, specifically experimental psychology, cognitive psychology, linguistics, and then there's also a lot of these disciplines have actually merged and cross-feed. So we'll talk a little bit about the relationship between psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics, right? And so there's more and more of a convergence and an interest in these different areas. So you can ask when you were saying, well, what's psycholinguistics? Well, how does language work in our heads? Our heads are, well, our brains, our nervous system, right? So we can study language without thinking about the brain circuitry, but ultimately there is the brain circuitry that does language in humans, right? How is it? And we'll see, maybe if you're interested in reading, that depends on you, if you're interested in reading in those papers, but we'll tend to stay on the more behavioral side, like the studies that look at how humans do language without going in and, sort of poking their, or looking at their brains. But more and more these areas, and including interpreting studies, look at what happens, what changes, what plasticity, what circuitry changes in the brain when you are very skilled multilingual and when you do interpreting. So there's a really interesting research area here. Okay, so what is psycholinguistics? So psycho marries linguistics. Okay, so this is psycho typically focuses on those mental processes. For example, finding words, lexical access, that's the term, lexical access. Lexical retrieval. Now I'm giving you the abstract definitions now, then you'll understand what they mean. Okay, so it's just to show you what the psycho part does and the linguistic part contribute to psycholinguistics. So lexical access, lexical retrieval, and grammatical encoding. So lexical access means, say I want to tell you something about, I don't know, my cat. My cat got lost this morning. I have a thought. I mean, a mundane, can be trivial. I have a pre-linguistic representation, which isn't in language, right? Something I want to tell you. And then you have to find the words in Italian, English, Chinese, whatever, and then not only know that those words exist, but actually retrieve that specific word. And how many of you know what a tip of the tongue state means? Tip of the tongue. That's exactly right. Tip of the tongue is a figurative expression of when you know what you want to say, but you temporarily can't access typically the word. Okay, so fenomeno di punta della lingua, punta della lingua. So tip of the tongue is an interesting state because speakers, so there's a part, you know that, for example, you want to say the word, let's say, what's the instrument that you draw circles with in English? Circles with. Okay, no, you know it. Okay, I was trying to give something that you okay, that you use to do that. I'm trying to come up with something low frequency. Can't come up with something low frequency. A definition of something low frequency where you know that that word exists. Okay, we typically have those states for proper names, like somebody's name, and it doesn't come. You have a temporary, right? That happens. Yes, or you know, well, street names, proper names. Okay, so tip of the tongue states you can induce experimentally, and they show you something about how it is that humans access the mental lexicon, right? So there's a gap between thinking and speaking. Thinking and speaking are not the same thing. So we were talking about the relationship between language and cognition, and that's a profound question. At the same time, before we speaking, even when we're speaking in our native language, involves translation. You're going from a non-linguistic representational system, which could be visual, which could be spatial, to something that has to be linguistically encoded. So the very act of speaking, even the easiest thing, like andiamo al bar dopo, that involves translation. You're going from a pre-linguistic to then encoding it. Right. And so the psycho is really interested in how that happens in sort of real time in our minds, the psycho part. What things help or hinder lexical access, the fact that when you think of a word, you're actually activating a cohort of words. It's a competitive process. There are other candidates that compete, right? So we'll read the first few chapters of the book of the Warren book deal with this. So finding words, building words, and the simple act of constructing a proposition so a verb and its argument structure, that also requires mental processes. Okay, so the first part of the course will talk about lexical access, lexical retrieval, grammatical encoding, and language production. Now, so the first three definitions, or the first three terms in the psycho part, concern language production, and then we have things, concepts that pertain to language comprehension. So parsing, how is it that we segment speech and actually assign to lexical access and comprehension? So it's sort of the converse operations. How do we chunk speech so that we can actually assign linguistic units and then compute meanings? And then psycho is also interested in the cognitive processes of both translation and interpreting as very sophisticated linguistic tasks, right? So here I've underlined these are sort of mental processes, and that's sort of more what the psycho part of it does. But we said that psycholinguistics is interdisciplinary. Oh, and the question is, what is the time course? Now, time course means what happens when, okay? And a lot of the operations that involve language processing happen in the order of milliseconds. So it takes about, if you just produce one word in isolation, so if I show you a picture of an object or an animal, it usually takes you about 600 milliseconds. How do I know? You don't measure it with a stopwatch. You actually have to have a computer record how long it takes to do that, right? So psycholinguists are really interested in how quickly or how these operations unfold over time. What kind of information? If you're, for example, understanding language in a visually rich environment, do you do linguistic analysis first and then integrate the visual, or do you do integration right away? Another area, and we'll read papers about this in comprehension now, what is the role of prediction when you're processing incoming speech, right? Your prediction ability, that's a very big area now. It's a very big area in interpreting too, because obviously when you're interpreting, you've got input in one language and you're predicting, and looking at the relationship between prediction in language comprehension and prediction in production. So that's kind of a very interesting area that intersects interpreting, psycholinguistics, and both comprehension and production. But we'll start looking at these things sort of in terms of, the beginning of the course will be a little bit like if you study physics and then you want to understand climate. You start with the building blocks, okay? What are the building blocks? And then you think about how is it that it actually works in a much more complex case, as, for example, just, what we're doing now. We're talking about difficult things and integrating all kinds of information, right, in real time. So psycho is really interested in the time course. Whereas when you do linguistics, you tend to think of the building blocks. Okay, so what is the time course and what are the processes? And the linguistic part provides us with representations. Okay, how is phonology? What are the sound structures? How are they represented? And what are the units at the level of phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, right? So this is where the two fields really, really synergistically contribute to different aspects, right? So what's the time course? What's lexical access for morphologically complex words? Do we represent words as stored units, or do we actually decompose them? At what stage, when we produce language, do we actually access the sound structure? When does phonological encoding happen, right? So we'll see that the combination of the psycho and the linguistics allows us to ask and to understand in detail how it is that we do things like language, right? So we need both the psycho and the linguistic. Right, so the next two slides are actually questions that come from chapter 1 in the Paul Warren book. Once I email you the PDF, I didn't feel comfortable emailing the PDF of the book. I prefer to give you a link or put it on Virtuale. I don't know. I mean, I don't know, because I actually found it available online and downloaded it from a site. So I don't know. In Virtuale, yes. Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's because we're doing it for educational purposes, and that's what I usually do. I put all the PDFs. I just didn't want to email it. I thought, I'm new at Unibo, and maybe then they'd like flag me for doing something illegal, or, so I didn't want to do that. But you will have access to the PDF of the book. And of course, you're very welcome to buy the hard copy if you want it, right? That's up to you. So these are some of the questions that come at the beginning of the introductory chapter. So what are the questions that psycholinguistics specifically addresses? So what does it mean to know a language? Traditionally, this is called competence, right? Sort of, what do you know when you know Italian, Chinese, English? And what does it mean to use the language or to, now I use the term process, but what I mean is use. Okay, so process or process, we switch between those two pronunciations. So process the language or process the language. And in linguistic terminology, going back to the sort of Chomsky competence performance, this corresponds to performance. Psycholinguistics deals with performance. Personally, as a linguist, I am interested in approaches to language that explain both competence and performance, right? So that's kind of, and there are theories of language that do this, sort of usage-based approaches to linguistic, to language. So how do people understand language? How do they produce language? How do they acquire language? And how does it happen in multilinguals? But you can ask questions about how do people process syntactic relationships. For example, you have long distance dependencies where you find words like a WH question where you have one word separated at a long distance from other words. What kind of cognitive cost does that have? And you can also ask that question in production, right? What is the effect of holding on to relationships between words at a distance? For example, producing a WH question or a relative clause. Is it costly in production? Okay, so you can ask questions at all levels of linguistic representation: syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and phonology. And you can also ask these questions for each modality: comprehension, production, visual, auditory, spoken, and written. And this is a little bit the sort of the classic approach to psycholinguistics, is to study each one of these component processes separately, with the understanding that as humans, we do both. We're comprehenders and producers, and typically in conversation, we alternate, right? But in psycholinguistics, partly because there's evidence that some of these skills are actually done by different circuitry, different areas, different neural circuitry does comprehension and production, and you have evidence from, for example, language impairments, that you can actually have problems with one modality but not another, right? So there's a tradition of studying these separately, and not because we think that they don't ultimately serve comprehension and production, but the other reason is that the techniques used to study comprehension are very different from the techniques used to study production. But we'll read some papers that integrate comprehension and production. So we'll do this in the course of sort of the readings. So you can ask questions for different populations: for adults, speakers with impairments, children, bilinguals, second or foreign language users, older adults, and then dialogue and so on. Okay, so it's a very exciting field and broad. So these are some of the representational questions that Paul Warren lists on page 4, introduction to psycholinguistics. So how is the mental lexicon organized in our heads? Is it organized semantically? Is it time? Oh, right. Bye-bye. So see you tomorrow. Right, yeah. Okay, so how do humans store words in our heads? Okay, so we know what they're like in dictionaries. They're alphabetically, but everything okay? No worries, no worries. Had she forgotten something?
I thought you were able to adapt.
Oh, I see, I see. There you go. Right? So do we, in our minds, our mental lexicon, do we store meaning relationships or phonetic relationships? Okay. Now the answer is, well, kind of both, right? So our minds care about semantics, about meaning relationships, but also phonological. So words that sound similar also have phonological neighborhoods. Okay. Another question that you can ask psycholinguistically is, right, So is cat stored close to dog? I like to use the cat and dog, and there's cat and dog examples. Okay, so is cat stored close to dog, or rat, or both, or neither? Okay, so what's the cat and dog, they're sort of semantically related, but what's the relationship between cat and rat? So cat and rat, the word cat and the word rat. Yes, okay, so they have a semantic relationship, and they're both animals and so on. So they have a semantic relationship, but they also have, yes, phonological representation. They actually also have phonological overlap. This will turn out to be interesting and important. Okay. So these are sort of psycholinguistic questions. Now, and I'm going to focus on English. So the book is entirely centered on English, but you can ask these questions about any language. So you have the psycholinguistics of any language, including sign languages, right? Sign language psycholinguistics. So do English speakers have phoneme size? So are phonemes real? This is basically what the question is. So do we really mentally represent phonemes? Or is that something that human? Well, that's a question. That's a question. No. Do we represent them in our heads when we do language? It's a general question. Well, yeah, I'm not asking you, but this is a psycholinguistic question. We'll find out. That's a question. You could say, well, that's something that linguists come up with it's a way to describe the units of language, but the phonemes aren't real. Psycholinguists, actually, real meaning psychologically real. Okay, so we'll find an answer to this question. So these kinds of representational questions, right? Are these the building blocks of language? And what evidence? How would I go about finding out? Okay. So for English, do speakers have phoneme size units in their heads? So is the word cat ultimately decomposed into k, a, and t? What do you think? What's your name? Yes, and Samuele. What do you think? You don't.
Just learn the way the words sound when they achieve that they talking about when they.
Oh, okay, but that's a good question. So, and thank you for bringing that up. And this is a sort of a later slide. None of this, when you say represent, we don't mean that you are conscious of it. So remember when I said psycholinguistics actually looks at really unconscious processes. We're not aware of this. We become aware of it either, well, we'll tell you when we become aware of it. In fact, you become aware of it either when things go wrong, and we'll see, but we're not aware of it. It's basically implicit knowledge. Okay, so that's a very good point. Thank you for saying we're not conscious of it, but our behavior tells us that in fact these things have a role, both when we produce and when we comprehend language. Okay, but that's a very good point. Yes, implicit, not explicit. And then obviously when you study linguistics, that's meta-linguistic knowledge. Then you describe a language in terms of phonemes and so on, right? But the kind of knowledge that we're focusing in this part of the course is implicit knowledge. Speakers are not aware of it. They just do it. They exhibit that behavior. Just like when we walk, I mean, we're respecting, all kinds of, is it raining out there? Yes, it started to rain. It looks kind of gloomy outside. Right, all kinds of things that were not deliberate. That's why it's unconscious. In fact, procedural knowledge. Okay. I'm sorry. I want you to be surprised. What do you think? You don't know. Yes, actually, it turns out, yes, yes, and we'll see how, well, one source of evidence, and we'll see, comes from errors. When you make a speech error, not a speech error in your L1. And in fact, I'm going to ask you to collect speech errors. So speech errors are super interesting. Speech errors, for example, if I were to say, somebody wants to say, clear blue sky, and instead says clear blue sky, something where you know, when you anticipate a sound or switch sounds, or you say, for example, you want to say tummy, but you say stomach. So stomach, stomach and tummy. Then somebody says stomach, right? These are examples in English. So there you have, you basically have two competing words. So you know what the concept is, and then you're doing this competitive lexical access process, and then you do a blend in this case, right? And the things that the constraints on errors tell you a lot about this kind of, they provide answers to this question. So errors are super interesting. These errors that are obviously not deliberate errors that we make all the time, in fact. Speakers make these errors, and a lot of the early work on understanding how we produce language was built on analyses of error corpora. So looking at the properties of errors, and not just what goes wrong, but what stays right. So when we'll look at this, we'll look at the data. Okay, so that's one source of evidence. Another source of evidence comes from experiments. So if I show you, if I give you pictures, and that's something, you know, psycholinguists tend to break down language to its like simple tasks, simple tasks, but they're not simple. They're there, you know, sort of for a purpose. You're interested in how, excuse me, the mind represents, stores, and processes language. And so language is very complicated, and you actually have to separate some of the variables. So if you're interested in asking, for example, whether humans recognize semantic relationships between words, one technique is to present them with words that are either semantically related. So for example, if I actually ask you, there's multiple ways to do this, but I can show you pictures and measure how fast you are at saying the word. And prior to giving you the picture, I prime you with a word. I activate a word. I show, so for example, you're naming pictures of animals, and you see the word cat, and then you have to name dog. And then I compare that to naming how fast you are saying dog when I've primed you with a word like cat or an unrelated word like boat. And then I can measure, right? Again, we said time course. I can measure that time. That tells me something about lexical access. There's some really interesting findings there. And it tells you, it shows you that we basically access meaning first. We do the meaning part first. So we go from a concept to the meaning. And then we later do the phonology in production. Okay, and this is kind of a time, I mean, we're talking, you know, milliseconds. So, but the first 300 milliseconds, we're doing the semantics. Then we're retrieving the word form, right? And that's the 600 milliseconds that it takes to name something. So 600 milliseconds don't seem like a long time in terms of like real life consequences, but it is a long time for the brain. And it means that you're actually, if you're presenting information, for example, that you're doing lexical access is competitive. So you're activating multiple words, and then you have to select the right one. And that's already complex in one language. It's obviously more complex if you're doing two, right? So, yeah. Can you tell me what your name is? Francesca, yes. Sure. Yeah.
Are they from matter of fact, or do they also find solutions to improve, I don't know, for speakers to learn their language?
Yes, that's a good question. So there's like in any area, if you understand how something works, then there's kind of like the basic science, the basic research, and then there's applications. So psycholinguistics greatly informs, for example, speech therapy, like everything that has to do with what happens in the brain after a stroke. That's profoundly influenced by psycholinguistics. Second language learning, right? There's a whole sort of understanding how the mind works in a second language. So ultimately teaching. Now, the relationship isn't always obvious because then there are communities of practice and schools of thought and ways of doing things, right? But the potential is certainly those two areas. Understanding what happens in the multilingual mind when you do interpreting. So we'll read some of these papers looking at what happens, what's going on in terms of the competing costs and cognitive load when you're doing this multilingual processing. So those two areas, yes. Language acquisition, language disorders, and then also the psycholinguistic part is sort of, this is how humans do it. Then there's a whole issue of computational models of how humans do this, right? So those are the first three things that come to mind. Yes. No stupid questions. That's not, no question is.
Okay. Well, have there ever been studies about like time that a normal person has to like reach the board and the time that that person under the effects of alcohol or drugs and the.
Interesting, yes. Well, there are studies, yes, there are actually studies to answer your question. So there are studies, let me answer it, of the effect of fatigue and oxygen deprivation and aging and so on. Are there studies under the effect of alcohol? I'm sure there are. The answer is what happens under those conditions, and we'll talk about it a little bit. It doesn't fundamentally change. It makes things, for example, slurring and articulatory things, less precise. You make more errors when you're tired, but it doesn't change the nature of the errors. It makes them more likely, right? So anxiety, fatigue, oxygen deprivation, and so on are all things that, for example, aging, normal aging. So people have looked at what happens to speakers as they age, and if there's an interest in trying to disentangle what's healthy aging from, what's pathological aging. And so, for example, tip of the tongue states, they're more frequent in aging. So all of those things that alter the process and cognitive load, like, for example, doing the kinds of things when you do like interpreting, right? So there are experimental studies that try to make errors more likely, right? And then the answer is you still have the same building blocks. There's like errors are more likely, but the nature of errors doesn't change. I'm using the example of errors because we talked about errors. Okay. Then there's all the issue of language pathology, and the nature of the errors changes. So somebody who's had a stroke and will make kinds of errors that typical speakers don't make. Okay. So, but to go back to your question, Francesca, understanding psycholinguistics helps you understand what happens in those. It makes you linguistically savvy about what's going on. For example, I don't know if you've ever talked to anybody who's had a stroke. Have you had an experience with talking to somebody who's had a stroke? Well, we'll look at a video. I mean, there's remarkable things that can happen, and you think, oh my goodness, this person can't say verbs, but they're still getting the meaning across. But for example, accessing verbs becomes, difficult. Anyway. Yeah. Yes.
It's also related to the age of the speaker, because like sometimes children are easier to make some kind of sound or a simple language than grown.
Yes, that's a related question. So when is it that humans develop this ability to tune into the sound structure of a language? But we all sort of kind of have the ability to represent speech categorically. Categorically, did you, someone. Did you talk about categorical perception in your linguistics classes?
I think I have.
Okay, so categorical perception means, for example, we're very good in our first L1 or a language that you've had, either very early exposure. The literature on plasticity is changing, like the ability to acquire another language. I mean, we used to think it was like, it was a fixed time, but it's not exact. We have a lot more plasticity than plasticity meaning ability to learn, to change. Okay, so plasticity means changing based on experience. So the idea was that early on, so at birth, infants can already perceive things about the speech of the language that they're exposed to, and that between 6 and 10 months, they then lose the ability to discriminate, to make those distinctions that are not relevant to the phonemes of the language that they're exposed to. For example, say you're learning, let's see, give me an example. So if you're learning that early on, well, I'll give you an example of categorical perception, but it is not now because I don't have the slide. Okay, so we'll talk about how it is that we do speech perception in the perception part of the course. Okay, but that is also connected to how is it that kids develop these generalizations. So phonemes are abstractions. They really are. It's a sound. It's like, I always use this example when I teach phonetics. I say it's like, I like the cat example. You have a category. It's sort of, you have different instances of a sound that might differ slightly. How you say it, "the" in English versus Italian differs in terms of duration of the voicing, blah, blah. And, but you're able to recognize that as "but" and not "but," if your language has that distinction, right? So it is connected. But so generalizations that humans then store as part of the inventory of their language. Yes. Well, we're not doing acquisition of babies in this class. Well, that's very interesting, super interesting. So how do speakers represent meaning? And these are all questions. Okay, for Warren, page 4 says these are psycholinguistic questions. How do we mentally represent the meanings of sentences and propositions? And do we store words? So this is a morphologically complex word in English, government. Is it a unit, or do we actually, pass it down, okay, into its component parts? Okay, so see that these are processing questions, but they are about linguistic units, right? We're talking about, so this is where it's representations and asking, does this really happen in our heads or not? Or is it just something that linguists come up with? Right? So it's a question about mental representations of units of language. And then you have processing questions. When native speakers hear speech, do they analyze the acoustic input into single phonemes, or do they identify bigger chunks such as syllables or longer strings? So we end at 12:30, right? Yep. Right, okay. Sorry, I've just been very chatty today. How do they succeed in recognizing words? Do they understand complex words via morphological decomposition? And if plurals, like cat, are not represented in the mental lexicon, do speakers use an abstract rule to generate a plural? And what about irregulars? How do we store irregulars? It's all about mental representations. And how is it that we speak? How do we turn pre-linguistic thoughts into well-formed utterances in any language? Right, so I said, speaking is a translation process. You're going from different codes So you grammatically encode. They have some slides on the history of psycholinguistics. Let me see. I wanted to show you this. Sorry, this picture. Okay, so this picture is taken from a different book. So it basically illustrates in a picture what the domain of psycholinguistics is. And on the production side, right, going from an idea, a thought, pre-linguistic thought that you want to convey, to selecting the words, finding the words, then building a syntactic representation that allows you to encode the meaning. So if you say the cat chased the rat, it means something different from the rat chased the cat, right? So you have a relational information that you wish to convey, and then how is it that you find the words and then actually in real time assemble them so that you actually produce something you intend to say. And then, interestingly, we'll see that the phonological representation step happens later, so that you've actually done sort of more of this invisible part about finding words, computing those relationships, subject, verb, object, and so on, or semantic relationships, agent, patient, and then you phonologically encode. Even if when we produce and things go well, that's seamless. You think you have a thought and you just say it, right? That's kind of when it's skilled, that's what you think you're doing, but you're not. You're doing all kinds of operations. The gray box is still in the picture, corresponds to something invisible. It's in our heads. It's happening in the mind. Then the output of all of this is actually sending it to articulatory plans. Okay, so you can actually study language production without asking anybody to say anything. And here in this picture, it's basically showing you what happens in spoken production, but you have the same steps if you're signing, if you've sign language. And in fact, you're doing similar steps if you're writing, right? So there's something, in this case, it's just showing the output systems, but there's a lot going on cognitively before you actually produce anything. And then the converse operation, it is doing the opposite, analyzing auditory, low-level auditory analysis. Then you're doing phonological analysis. You're accessing the lexicon in comprehension. So as I speak, you're doing all kinds of things. You're segmenting speech. You're analyzing it lexically, and then computing the relationships between the words, and basically coming up with a message, right? So this is sort of what psycholinguists do. And this is a model for one language, but we'll see that this model also works for bilinguals. Okay, so what do we do when we have two languages or more, right? Yes. What's your name? Jennifer. Mm-hmm. Okay, the extent of phonological, well, so if you're a signer, I mean, if your native language is sign, you still have phonological, meaning that there's units that have to do with hand shape and so on. So the correspondence of sign language phonology, right? So looking at hand shape and all the modifiers, it just means that the articulators are in a different modality. Okay, so you do talk about sign language phonology, even if that doesn't correspond to something acoustic. Okay, so the question of what modality these representations are in we'll get to that question. What's the relationship between comprehension and production? Is it the same brain circuitry that does both, or are they separate? Remember I said psycholinguists tend to separate them out because there's evidence that after all, these are different operations. You're doing your different kind of input, different kind of brain circuitry. But then there's a way in which both of them are language, and these are linguistic units. And maybe we have some kind of supramodal meaning that it's not auditory, it's not visual, and it's not motor, but it's abstract. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting question. Okay, what are there areas that are specific by modality, or are there central areas that process and represent and process language in a way that's not dependent on modality? Okay, that's a profound question. Okay, so psycholinguistics really inherits from cognitive science, this idea that you can, in fact, look inside the black box. You can actually have, and this is sort of typically attributed to Chomsky's contribution in linguistics, to say that you can actually you can hypothesize, you can have hypotheses as to what these representations are. Okay, so you can actually this is sort of a bit of a metaphor sometimes, but it served and guided a lot of what we know in psycholinguistics, to think of the human mind as a complex system that receives, stores, retrieves, transforms, integrates information, right? And once you adopt so the brain is an information processing center, hub, right? So you're doing integration, sensory input, motor, coordinating everything, and basically doing information integration and processing. So once you adopt this hypothesis, then this gives you a window onto how to study language and cognition. And this view was not the view that dominated up until the 1950s, which was very much the behaviorist view, that you couldn't actually have hypotheses as to how the mind works. Okay, so this is, remember when I was saying that you can do linguistics, psycholinguistics, and then neurolinguistics. I said something like about the brain, right? So this is also an area that's traditionally you think, well, people who study the brain are brain scientists, and they study cells and neurons and so on. But then the question is, well, if you're studying language, say you're interested in the cognitive aspects of interpreting, right? Unless you know what the behavior is, the brain isn't really going to tell you anything, right? So this, there's a famous vision scientist called David Marr who talked about this in a book called Levels of Explanation, right? So that when you're studying complex behavior, you need all levels to explain the behavior. And it's not the case that, say, you want to know what happens when people understand passive sentences or whatever, and you image the brain, you still have to know the linguistic part, because the brain needs the behavior to explain what's going on, right? And this is a challenging area because it sort of it gets challenging from a practical point of view in terms of the training and who does what kind of training you receive, who does the kind of research and this is where you get into really nice interdisciplinary research, where maybe you work with a medical doctor for the imaging part, but then the interpreter asks about what we're talking about, what are the consequences of interpreter training on the brain. That's a very interesting question. Why is it interesting to brain scientists? It's a question about brain plasticity. What happens when you become an expert at something, right? So that's a super interesting question. And that's where you need a combination of knowing what the behavior is and then knowing some of the tools to do that kind of research, right? So this is levels of explanations. So what information processing problem is being solved? What are you doing when you comprehend in one language and you produce in another? What steps are being carried out to solve this problem? And what's your brain doing, right? Those are all three ways to ask that question. All right, it is now 12:30, and we'll continue tomorrow. Right, so this was very confusing. I panicked this morning. I thought, oh my gosh, because I saw that time change. You don't have it? I had, what did I email you? Because it keeps on changing and you don't have it at all? Yes, it's from 1 to 2:30 and it's in DIT, right?
Well, 9.
So if you check now, sorry, because I know that they made an error this morning and then they fixed it. So if you go to sorry. Oh, well, Veronica. Sorry, Veronica.
That's okay.
Okay.
Because before closing, we have to stop the recording.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's safe, because if we leave without stopping, it doesn't save it.
Can I have a question in the meantime?